What's up guys, my name is Ace, and it's time for part 2 of my final review of Modern Warfare 2. The first part, we talked about everything that I felt Modern Warfare 2 did right, and today we're going to be looking at the flip side, and I'm going to be sharing all of the main things that I feel Modern Warfare 2 did wrong. Now, of course, keep in mind, many of these areas will be quite subjective. It's totally fine if you disagree with my opinions. I'd love to know why you disagree in the comments down below. And also, just to be clear up front here, since this is going to be quite a negative and critical video, I'm not one of the people that absolutely hates Modern Warfare 2. I don't think this game is like absolute trash or anything. However, in saying that, I do hate a lot of the design decisions they made with this game that I feel significantly held it back from ever reaching its potential. So I did manage to find some fun with it throughout the year in limited doses, but it also left a lot to be desired. And let's kick this off with one of the worst decisions I feel they made with Modern Warfare 2. This is their perk system. The fact that you have to charge up 2 of the tiers of your perks and you don't get them the moment you spawn in at the beginning of the game was a very strange decision that makes zero sense to me. To me, it adds literally nothing positive whatsoever to the gameplay experience, and all it does is harm the experience. The first issue with this is, in many cases, your perks determine your playstyle. You select certain perks to support a certain playstyle. If you don't have those perks at the beginning of the game, you essentially don't have that full playstyle at the beginning of the game. What good does limiting playstyles at the beginning of a match do for anybody? Playstyle variety is a good thing. It should be encouraged. It should be fostered. It shouldn't be put on a time gate. It shouldn't be held back. Again, this adds nothing positive to the gameplay experience for me, and all it does is takes away from it. Additionally, I found with this charged perk system, it forced them to balance many of the perks based on charging rather than based on balancing the tiers properly with each other. If you eliminate charging from the equation, it would make sense to shuffle a bunch of these perks around and put them in different tiers of perks so that they have proper competition within those tiers. But there's certain perks like Overkill, for instance, where it doesn't make sense to have that on a charge. You can't really have the Overkill perk on a charge, and therefore that had to be a basic perk in the game, and that created several balancing issues on its own, because that is more appropriately balanced against something like the Ghost perk, for instance. But you can't put it against the Ghost perk because the Ghost perk is on a charge timer. So again, this is just another area with this perk system where it introduces new issues that have never been issues before in previous perk systems, while adding nothing positive to the gameplay experience. And that's not even mentioning, one of the staples of Infinity Ward Call of Duty games since Modern Warfare 3 is the Specialist bonus, where you can get perks instead of kill streak rewards as you go on a streak in the same life. This is a feature that I absolutely love and really look forward to with Infinity Ward Call of Duty games, and yet this style of perk system prevents that from really being a viable option in the game, and therefore we didn't have access to Specialists this time around. Also, one other thing I almost forgot to mention here is with Modern Warfare 2, we have perk packages. You can't customize each class individually with perks. Instead, you're limited to these 5 packages of perks at any given time. So we have 10 loadouts available, but only 5 perk combinations that you can use for those 10 loadouts. And if you want to change one single perk just on one of your loadouts, well, too bad. Any other loadout that you have that uses that same perk package, you're also changing the perk on that loadout. And again, this just doesn't make any sense. I don't see how this adds anything positive to the gameplay experience. So in my eyes, this perk system was a complete failure. It introduced a bunch of new issues, it caused things to be overly restrictive, and to me at least, it had no positive impact to the gameplay experience at all. I honestly don't know how this feature even got past the brainstorming phase. I'm totally fine with innovation, but if you're going to innovate and completely rework an area that's core to the franchise that you're developing in, you should at the very least be making a pros and cons list with that, and if the cons are clearly outweighing the pros, then maybe don't implement that system. I really don't get what they were going for here. This is something that had immediately obvious issues with it from the moment it was first shown to us, and we provided feedback on this right away. We hammered on this really hard from the beginning, and yet they stubbornly stuck to this system, and it's one of the biggest things that held this game back. As for the next thing that's actually not looking quite as bad now that we've played the Modern Warfare 3 beta, unfortunately, this is the spawn system. The spawn system in Modern Warfare 2 isn't good in my eyes. It's gotten to the point where I've been playing the game for a year now. I've learned the spawns quite well. I know the spawns, so I can deal with it, but they're still not great, and I feel they significantly harm the pacing and the flow on these maps. One of the big criticisms I often see with this game is the map design, and I actually disagree with that. I think the maps, with a few exceptions, are generally quite good in Modern Warfare 2. But the spawn system destroys the flow on them, destroys the pacing on them, and quite honestly makes them play like crap in a lot of game modes. I think if you took many of the maps in this game and gave them a more traditional Call of Duty spawn system, we would be seeing much more positive opinions on these maps within the community. Now, I don't want to dive super deep into the spawns since I have talked about these with great detail in previous videos over the year, but a few primary issues I've got with these. There's a lot of mid-map spawns where when you spawn in, it's possible that there's enemies behind you. You don't spawn on the edge of the map where you know that at least your back is safe and you just have to push forward and work from there. There are many situations on many maps where you're spawning inside a building with the potential for enemies to be in a 360-degree radius to you. So that's one part of it, just poor spawn placement in general. The next big thing is this is more of a squad spawn style system where they don't really anchor the team spawn to one end of the map or the other, outside of like the super linear maps like Border Crossing or Zarqwa Hydroelectric, for instance. Instead, you've got practically randomized flow like all over the maps, because the spawn is constantly flowing around the map. This also really kills the flanking playstyle, because the moment you start flanking an enemy team, now your teammates just anchor to you and start popping up all around you, ruining that element of surprise that you were going for on your flank. And finally, the spawn system in this game ruined Domination for me. Domination has always been my favorite game mode in Call of Duty until Modern Warfare 2. It absolutely destroyed my will to play this game mode, because there's very little spawn attachment to the flags that your team owns. And as a result, it's no longer a map control game where capturing a flag secures that area of the map for your team to spawn in and blocks the enemies from spawning in that area, forcing them to have to come and capture that area from you. Instead, it basically plays like Team Deathmatch, and there happen to be flags laying around the map that you could capture, but they don't really mean anything when it comes to the overall map control that your team holds. But then let's move on to the next area that I didn't really like about Modern Warfare 2, and this was unnecessary visual recoil. Now, this is a topic I covered in great detail not too long ago, but essentially one of the big differences with Modern Warfare 2 compared to even its predecessor, Modern Warfare 2019, is the gun model had a tendency to rotate a lot more as you were firing, which made for a very jarring visual effect where that gun was just bouncing all over the place, and it made it very difficult to track your targets. And then on top of that, there was an overabundance of muzzle smoke that would often make it feel like a strobe light effect as you were firing a gun full auto. And to me, these are just unnecessary effects. I don't mind actual recoil. I like controlling actual recoil. What I don't like are unnecessary and visually jarring effects that don't actually affect where your bullet placement is. It just makes it harder to see what you're shooting at and harder to correct for that actual recoil that's happening, which just introduces unnecessary randomness into the experience. And speaking of visual effects that harm the experience, another thing I noticed with this game as well, it seemed like much more than previous games, is there was a lot of lingering particle and dust effects or smoke effects with certain explosives going off on the map, especially certain kill streak explosives like an SAE or a cruise missile, for instance. And the thing about these is, unlike a smoke grenade, as far as we've been able to tell as a community, these particular effects are generated client side, and that means there can be a mismatch in what players are able to see, meaning that for one player, there's so much lingering smoke and dust they can't see anything through it, but on the other side of that, that person can see just fine through that, creating an obviously imbalanced situation. Another thing to point out here is for controller players versus mouse and keyboard players, again, unlike smoke grenades, your aim assist will work through these lingering particle and dust effects. With an actual smoke grenade, this disables your aim assist as you're trying to aim through that. It doesn't work the same way with these lingering effects. Your aim assist still works through that, giving controller players an unfair advantage over mouse and keyboard players in that situation. And on top of that, another thing that differentiates these visual effects from actual smoke grenades is the fact that if you're aiming through them, you can actually see those enemy diamonds appear above their head, whereas that's not going to happen with a smoke grenade. And again, this can just lead to some confusing situations, especially because they don't display properly in kill cams. Now, I'm not saying they should have completely eliminated the effects, but the thing I noticed about them that made them far worse than many previous years of Call of Duty is just how long those effects linger on the screen. When a grenade goes off, of course, I want to see some particle effects. I want it to look cool, but I'd like to see that fade away in a reasonable amount of time. Same thing when a cruise missile hits the ground. It's cool that there's a big explosion and you know that that was a big explosion, but for the sake of gameplay, it should be fading away after the explosion significantly sooner. After that, speaking of explosives, something I really didn't like that they introduced in Modern Warfare 2 is the fact that explosives will stop you from sprinting for a couple seconds, and that couple of seconds feels like a very long time, especially in a stress situation where you're trying to evade where that explosion came from, which is often going to be the case. This just felt like a very unnecessarily punishing mechanic that shouldn't have existed, especially if you're using Blast Shield, which is the perk that's designed to counter an explosive. What's the point of countering that explosive and surviving it, only to be locked in place so that the enemy can easily clean you up? There is more than enough punishment already by taking explosive damage. It doesn't also need to slow you down and lock you in place for people to kill you. I should also mention a similar thing applied with direct impact from throwables. So if somebody threw a frag grenade at you and it bounces off of you, again, that's going to lock you in place temporarily and prevent you from sprinting. And I just felt like this was a very unnecessary mechanic to be added to the game that just introduces frustration and slows things down for no particular reason. As for the next thing, let's shift over to the camo challenges. And for those of you guys that watched part 1 of this series, I actually really like the camo structure in this game. The general structure of how they handle camos I thought was excellent. The one big gripe I had, though, is an overabundance of long shot requirements on just about every one of the weapon classes in the game. Now, to be clear, I do think there should definitely be a grind behind unlocking that mastery camo, and it should be challenging to some degree. But the problem with long shots is they're not necessarily challenging, they're just tedious and boring. Especially with how these maps are designed, you have to play in a very specific way, in very specific areas of the map, and you basically just have to sit there pre-aiming a lane, hoping you get decent traffic so you can pick people off as they walk in your sights. In my opinion, camo challenges are far better when they're engaging, and long shots simply aren't an engaging style of challenge. Now, I'm not saying long shots have no place in the camo grind. I don't mind going for long shots on a couple of the classes of weapons, for instance. However, in Modern Warfare 2, you needed long shots on pretty much everything in the game if you wanted the mastery camo, and that was just too much. It got to the point where it was overly tedious, and it really led to a lot of burnout as I was going through those challenges, because it felt like I didn't actually get to play the game as I was playing the game. Now, let's refocus on the general gameplay here. A big thing that I feel held Modern Warfare 2 back quite considerably is the fact that they eliminated a lot of the tools and options for aggressive playstyles. And a big part of the marketing for this game was appealing to a wide variety of playstyles. Yet in this game, I constantly get the feeling that I'm being held back from playing as aggressively as I'd like, or there are certain options that I would love to be able to have to play aggressively, but those options just aren't really viable in this game. And that's one of the reasons that there's so much jump shotting in Modern Warfare 2. That's basically the one consistently viable option that we have as aggressive players if we want to be the one initiating a gunfight as we come around a corner. And it's unfortunate because I don't want to jump shot every corner like that, but when that's the best consistent option available to us, of course I'm going to take advantage of that and use it as much as possible, because it's not like I can slide around that corner. For the majority of this game's life cycle especially, sliding was not a viable aggressive tool. There was a massive slide to fire delay, so if you slide around a corner, you're basically just kind of stuck there in that animation waiting for someone to shoot you. And I'm fine with the fact that they eliminated slide cancel, but they should have at least allowed you to fire inaccurately from the hip while sliding with no delay outside of maybe your sprint to fire time. Now, they definitely made improvements to this much later in the game's life cycle. In fact, this was not too long ago that sliding suddenly became at least somewhat viable as an aggressive tool, but for the majority of the life cycle of this game, sliding was practically useless. Additionally, the base aim down sight strafe speeds were quite slow in this game as well, and therefore strafing around a corner wasn't viable with most builds. Now, I will admit there were a few exceptions here. Some guns had just the right combinations of attachments, and if you tuned everything just right and built everything just right, you could actually get quite a good strafe speed. However, those were quite rare, and unless you were using one of those builds, strafing is essentially off the table for you. So again, you just kind of revert back to that jump shot. And speaking of jump shots, even though that was our best option, they nerfed it harder than they've ever nerfed it before. In Modern Warfare 2, they added an aim down sight speed penalty to jump shots, and they effectively eliminated bunny hopping, where you don't maintain any momentum after a jump shot. And to be clear, I'm not even necessarily against those penalties for jump shotting, but if you're gonna do that, at least provide some more options and some more tools. Make sliding far more viable. Bump up those aim down sight strafe speeds considerably. Maybe drop some of the sprint out times a little bit so you can sprint and fire into a gunfight a little bit faster. Also, perhaps cut down on the aim down sight speed penalties that existed on many of the attachments in the game. This is something they did tune over time, but especially when the game launched, there were heavy penalties with so many of the good attachments in the game to your aim down sight speed, to the point where it was often in your best interest to just not be using attachments. So these are just a handful of things to illustrate that the aggressive tools that we had available to us and the options you have available if you want to push something aggressively were quite limited. And when you stack that against the fact that this game also had quite loud footsteps that can be heard through walls very easily with the right audio setup at least, with no ability to have a consistent counter perk, and with a nerfed version of the field upgrade of Dead Silence from Modern Warfare 2019, all of that combined heavily encourages slower playstyles and waiting for other people to make moves, while making it feel quite punishing to be the aggressor in fights, unless you mastered that one viable option, which is jump shotting. So I'm not going to sit here and say it was impossible to play aggressively in this game. That would be disingenuous. However, I do feel the gameplay design in general was stacked quite heavily in the direction of encouraging slower playstyles and more campy styles of play, and there were very few options available for aggressive play, which just led to far less interesting gameplay for those aggressive players out there. Like, sure, we adapted to it just fine and just implemented jump shots all the time, but many people don't like seeing jump shots all the time, and even me, as somebody that implements jump shots in my gameplay quite a bit, I'm sick of jump shotting in almost every situation. I'd love to have more tools available, because that would add a lot of depth to the gameplay. So if I end up in a situation where I want to aggressively challenge somebody around a corner, I'd love to be able to go through the list of options in my mind as to how I want to approach that situation. In Modern Warfare 2, unless I'm using a very niche strafe build, for instance, I already know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to jump shot that corner every single time. Now, I do want to circle back to something I briefly touched on, but I feel like I want to expand on this just a little bit. This is those loud footsteps and the lack of a solid counter to those loud footsteps. With the size of maps in Call of Duty 6v6 multiplayer, as well as the general engagement distances, having the ability to hear the exact location of players in real time without those players having much viable counterplay to that, aside from don't move or move very, very slowly, that harms the pacing, the flow, and the skill gap of the game. It takes very little skill to just hear a footstep and immediately know exactly where that player is in real time, and it just tracks with them in real time as well, compared to reading a minimap properly, learning how spawns work, learning how the big picture of the maps work, thinking about routes and timings, looking for gaps in your team's setup to know when an enemy may be sneaking up behind you, for instance, or maybe approaching you from around a corner. All of that requires far more awareness and processing of information in order to deduce where an enemy may be coming from at any given time. Whereas again, with loud footsteps, you just hear where they are and you know where they are now. Now, I have made a dedicated video on this in the past, actually before Modern Warfare 2 came out. I think I'll leave that link down below if you guys want to hear more of my thoughts on this, because there is a lot more that needs to be said there and a lot more nuance to that conversation. But I just wanted to express the frustration that I have with the fact that not only did we not have a Dead Silence style perk in the game, but also, they really doubled down from Modern Warfare 2019, and they nerfed the field upgrade version of that. I found that to be extra frustrating. I mean, I didn't like the fact that in Modern Warfare 2019, they turned it into a field upgrade instead of a perk, but now that we have the field upgrade version in Modern Warfare 2, I would kill to go back just to the Modern Warfare 2019 version of Dead Silence, where it didn't require an animation that could potentially get you killed just to activate it, and there wasn't a loud beeping sound when you activated it, making sure that anybody in your immediate vicinity knew that you're going into quiet mode now, so you better pay attention. That was one of the more baffling decisions I feel they made with Modern Warfare 2. It's like they looked at a lot of the feedback that many of us were providing, where we were saying, hey, we don't like the fact that Dead Silence is a field upgrade now, we prefer it as a perk, and instead of looking at that feedback and perhaps trying to find a middle ground or a compromise, maybe buffing that field upgrade a little bit, or, you know, maybe reducing the base footstep audio so it's less of something that you can rely on as your primary source of awareness, and therefore the need for Dead Silence isn't going to be quite as hefty. Instead, they went the complete opposite direction, and they just doubled down and made that field upgrade even worse, which just felt like a big slap in the face for all of us that were providing that feedback with Modern Warfare 2019. And this is going to segue into the next section that I've got here, which is just the general feeling of a lack of support for this game from Infinity Ward, as well as a lot of stubbornness with many of their design decisions. And when it comes to their lack of support, thinking back to the earlier days, I remember there was quite a big delay for Season 2 where we weren't getting any communication, we got no information about what was going on, and it just felt like they kind of let the game die off with the second half of Season 1. Now, I get part of that was over the holidays, and of course the devs deserve their holidays, but at the very least, some communication at that stage would have gone a long way. And I just remember the feeling at the time was that they just abandoned the game entirely. Like, there was no communication, there were a bunch of issues with the game at the time that we were looking for some fixes for, or at the very least, some communication that they were aware of the issues and they were going to be working on them, and yet we just got nothing but delays at the time. Additionally, they completely screwed with the suppressors with this game for a very long time. For several months after launch, suppressors weren't keeping you off the minimap. That was like the entire reason to use a suppressor, and it wasn't working as intended. It was disabling your ghost perk every time you fired, which is horrible because that's not like a little quality of life bug or issue that pops up with the game. That's a core issue with the balancing between playstyles. That effectively eliminated the stealth playstyle from the game for the first several months of the game's life cycle, and we provided feedback on this very early in the game's life cycle. In fact, I just went back and looked. I made my first video talking about this on November 5th, and this didn't get fixed until the middle of April. And then when they did eventually get on top of this, they seemingly forgot about integrated suppressors, which took another 4 months of pressure on them to get that finally worked out and into a state where they were working the same as the other suppressors in the game. Additionally, like I touched on earlier, sliding was practically useless as an aggressive tool for most of the life cycle, but eventually, late in the life cycle of the game, they ended up finally buffing the sliding to make it feel better. Another thing was streak call-in animations, just the simple ones where you pull out the smartphone to call in a UAV and a counter UAV. This is feedback we provided in the beta, and to my knowledge at least, this should have been a very quick and easy fix. Again, this took them so many months to make this adjustment, and it's just so many little things like this that added up throughout the life cycle where it's like, why is this broken still? In fact, looking at the game right now, we're at the end of the life cycle of Modern Warfare 2, and there is still a massive UAV bug present where the UAV works inconsistently depending on the map that you're playing on. On some maps, the standard UAV is still working almost as good as an advanced UAV, and while they have been improving this slowly over time, this is a bug that's been present since the launch of Season 4, and it's still not fully fixed, and I don't even know if Infinity Ward knows that it's not fully fixed at this stage. To my knowledge, as far as we can see in the community, Infinity Ward thinks they've fixed this bug entirely, and I don't think it will ever be fully fixed. And once again, this isn't just a little quality of life bug, this isn't just a preference sort of thing, this is a clear and obvious bug that shouldn't be present in the game. You shouldn't have an entirely different UAV behavior depending on the map that you're playing on. And if you do, and that's an intended mechanic, that should be stated somewhere. But this is clearly not an intended mechanic because they've been fixing it, or at least trying to fix it, over these past several months. So those are just a handful of some of the worst examples of them just not really properly supporting this game. For many of those issues, with a AAA studio in a game as a service, which Call of Duty is now, those are things that I feel should have been fixed within a season, like at most. And yet most of these issues took either months and months to get on top of, or in the case of the UAV bug, they still haven't fixed them to this day. Now on top of this, I wanted to talk about the fact that Infinity Ward really doesn't seem to like to listen to the feedback in the community. Now, I do understand completely, it's their game, and they don't need to listen to the community. They can do whatever they want with their game. But when they specifically ask for feedback, like pre-launch for instance, they were asking for our feedback, and then it seemed like they just completely ignored the main points of feedback that were in the community, that obviously doesn't go over well, and it's not a good look for them. I'm not saying they need to listen to absolutely every whim of the community. In fact, I think that would be very detrimental to a game to just follow every whim of what the community says. But in saying that, if you start seeing essentially uncontentious feedback popping up in the community, which there was a lot of that in the beta and in the early stages of the game, where it seemed like everybody or nearly everybody agreed that the game would be better off with a change to an area, at the very least, when you have those big issues, I feel a compromise at the very least would go a long way. Again, I'm not saying they need to change everything exactly the way the community says that it needs to be changed, but when there are some obvious issues where nearly every player that you ask for feedback is agreeing on and providing that feedback to you, and you don't make any effort whatsoever to improve in those areas, it's not a good look. And I think this year, stubbornness from Infinity Ward significantly harmed their brand image in the community, and they went from being the golden studio for many Call of Duty players out there to now one of the least favorite studios in the community based on what I'm seeing. So there we go, that's going to wrap it up for that section on the general lack of support and also just the apparent lack of care for the game from Infinity Ward. Kind of seemed like they did a lot of the bare minimum, and it took them way too long to get on top of clear issues with the game. Next, let's dive a little bit into the Gunsmith system. While I generally like the structure of Gunsmith, and I talked about that in part 1 of this video series, there are a few areas I did want to pick out that I didn't like about the Gunsmith this time around, And one of those things is obviously no visible stats in the Gunsmith. You couldn't see exactly what your attachments were doing. You couldn't see the stats of the gun. And this is a feature that we've had in the past couple Call of Duty games. We thought this was a nice innovation they brought with Black Ops Cold War, and they took a massive step back by not including these detailed stats, especially due to the fact that one of the new features that Modern Warfare 2 added was tuning. And while I don't think tuning is a horrible idea on its own, I do think it was a net negative to this game. I personally would have preferred if we didn't have tuning in this game, and a big part of that is due to the fact that we had no visible stats. Therefore, any tuning that we were doing, we were unable to see exactly what was going on to our gun. We couldn't see how much we were helping that characteristic we were tuning toward, and we couldn't see how much we were harming the characteristic that we were tuning against. And early on in the game's life cycle, tuning was balanced in such a way that those downsides often outweighed the upsides with tuning. But again, the only way to know this is with hours of meticulous hand testing and looking at things frame by frame to figure out exactly what the pros and the cons are when you're tuning that selection. This tuning system added a lot of unnecessary complexity, and it seemed to take a lot of extra work for them to include and balance for very little payoff at the end of the day. I mean, they have a hard enough time balancing weapons and attachments to begin with. Adding that extra layer of tuning on top of that and making sure the values that you're tuning are balanced appropriately and the pros and the cons are also balanced appropriately, that's something they had to work with several times throughout the year. They had to make a bunch of adjustments to how they handled tuning. And at least for me, I don't think tuning added enough to the gameplay experience to justify all of that time and effort that went into that could have potentially gone into things that would actually improve the gameplay experience overall. So again, I don't inherently hate tuning, I just don't think it fit well in Modern Warfare 2, especially since we couldn't see those advanced stats. And as a result, like I said, I consider tuning to be a net negative with Modern Warfare 2. And with that, it's finally time to get into the fully expected section of this video that I have to include every single year that they continue having this system in the game. This is their skill-based, or more accurately, performance-based or engagement-optimized matchmaking system combined with disbanding lobbies. Now, I'll try to keep it short and sweet here. You guys that have been around my channel have heard my arguments against this so many times over the years. I have completely beaten this horse to death. And if you don't want to hear it again, I'll have timestamps in the video. Just feel free to skip it. I'm not going to say anything new you haven't heard about this from me in the past. But disbanding lobbies completely destroy a lot of the community aspect of the game. They destroy that feeling of a story throughout the course of a gaming session. They eliminate any sense of like rivalries and rematches in the game. And while Modern Warfare 2 did try to implement a system late in the life cycle that allowed you to stick with the same team that you played with in the previous match, that was a poorly implemented system that doesn't address any of the primary concerns with disbanding lobbies. So again, I hate the fact that lobbies disband now. I really miss the days when you could develop those friendships and rivalries in a lobby, and you could stick with the same lobby game after game after game on a relatively consistent connection game after game after game. And even after all these years that we've had disbanding lobbies, it still makes me angry when I think back at how great those times were when lobbies stuck together. And it's just such a big shame that we've lost that over the years in Call of Duty. And that's just talking about the disbanding lobbies part. The other part is what I'm just going to call SBMM. I know it's more engagement optimized matchmaking and it's more based on recent performance rather than your career performance. But just for simplicity's sake, we're going to call it SBMM here. This system heavily manipulates your gameplay experience to the point where it often feels like the game is playing you rather than you playing the game. There's no longer those organic experiences. There's no longer mixed lobbies where you never know what you're gonna get, not only on a game-to-game basis, but even on a gunfight-to-gunfight basis, because we used to have much more mixed lobbies where there were some good players in a lobby, some average players, and some below-average players, and on a gunfight-to-gunfight basis, you never knew who you were gonna run into. You'd also tend to see a lot more variety in playstyles and weapons in those lobbies that you don't see nearly as much if you're a good player these days. And that's not even mentioning the fact that there's been plenty of evidence popping up over the years that the better you get, the less consistent your connection experience gets, because not only is it pulling you out after every single game so you can rematch make into a different lobby, the system also seems to be willing to sacrifice your connection quality, at least to some degree, in order to put you in a better skill match lobby. And that should never be the case, especially when we can't even see where we stand with this system. We don't get to see what our skill rating is. We don't get to see the skill rating of the enemies that we're playing against, so we can feel accomplished that we beat people that are in the top 5%, for instance. We don't know any of that. All of that's hidden in the background, and this strict level of skill matching doesn't belong in public matches where you don't even have a rank visible. This belongs in ranked play. Now, over the years, I have learned how to adapt to this system. Basically, do anything you can do to limit the pool of players that you're able to connect to. So what I've started doing is I just no longer play during peak hours. I avoid weekends. I avoid playing on evenings, because what I've found is when I play weekdays during the day, I get a far better mix of lobbies, and it feels somewhat like the old days. Additionally, I've found if I fill up my team with a bunch of viewers when I'm streaming, that also tends to yield a much better mix of lobbies. So there are things you can do to sort of get around this matchmaking without directly exploiting anything, but you shouldn't have to be jumping through hoops just to get a decent organic experience with the game. This should be the default with the game, at least in my opinion. So there we go. There's obviously much more to be said about disbanding lobbies and that engagement optimized matchmaking system, but I'm trying to keep that section at least reasonably short for this video since I've repeated myself so many times over the years. Now let's move on to the final section here, which is just going to be a good handful of miscellaneous items, just random things I wanted to point out that I didn't like so much in Modern Warfare 2. And the first thing in this section that I think most of the community agrees with at this point, the user interface sucks. It's horrible. It features far too much horizontal scrolling through menus instead of just displaying all of those options vertically on the same screen instead of scrolling across multiple screens. There are far too many tabs within tabs within tabs to get to settings. I just don't see what they were going for here unless they're just trying to pair this with a mobile game or something, because this user interface is horrible to navigate. There's still certain menus and areas where it takes me several seconds to really sit down and think about, wait, how do I get there again? When in previous Call of Duty games, I never had that issue. It became muscle memory and second nature almost immediately. I've been playing Modern Warfare 2 for a solid year now, and this is one of the only games I play, and yet I still sometimes struggle to remember how I get to a particular screen or menu. And that should be a clear indication that this isn't well designed. And that's not even mentioning the fact that there's lots of pop-ups and stuff telling you to buy things in the game when I've already paid full price for the game. It's fine you have microtransactions in it, but do you need to be throwing those in my face constantly for a game that I've already paid full price for? I get why they do it, but it does cause frustration on the user's end. Additionally, I guess I'll put this in the user interface section, but this is more so in the game itself when you're playing the game. One thing I dislike that we still don't have access to is any method of checking the perks that you currently have active or the charge status of your perks without dying. The only way to see that is to either die and respawn, that will show you your perk status the moment you respawn, or that will also pop up shortly before you earn that next perk. This is an absolute basic piece of functionality that should absolutely be built in with this perk system. Again, I don't like the perk system at all, but if you're going to implement it, at least give players the ability to see which perks are currently active or how far they have to go before they charge up their next perk. It may seem minor, but it's incredibly important to know that information at any given time. Speaking of this, the Killcams. I don't know if they've fixed this over time, but at least for a good portion of the game's life cycle, when you watch the kill cam, it wouldn't accurately show which perks that enemy player was using, or at least which perks were active at that given time. And that's another thing that's just really frustrating, because we reported this early on in the game's life cycle, and they either have never fixed it, or it's taken them a really long time to fix it. The reason I don't know if it's fixed is because I've learned to tone that information out completely, because it's unreliable information, and it was for many, many months. So why would I even bother checking anymore when I know it's unreliable? Now, admittedly, something like this may seem very minor, but it's just little things like this that are basic functionality of the game where it really adds up when they're not working properly or they don't exist at all, and it just creates unnecessary frustration. Next, something that I really didn't like about Modern Warfare 2 is the lack of map voting. Now, I know partially this can go along with the fact that lobbies disband, so what's the point of map voting anyway? But we've had several Call of Duty games now with map voting available, even though they have these disbanding lobbies. And what I found is, with no map voting available, this means when people end up on the maps that they don't want to play, like Black Gold or Border Crossing for instance, naturally a lot of them leave, since that's the only way to opt out of playing those maps, which means there's always so many spots to fill in those lobbies, and therefore if you aren't picky and leaving them, you're much more likely to end up on the less popular maps than the more popular maps. And that was my experience throughout the year with Modern Warfare 2. In the past couple months, I bet I've got more games on Black Gold and Border Crossing than any other map in the game. And while I don't mind playing the less popular maps from time to time, it is kind of annoying that those are the ones I play more than any other map in the game. After that, I do want to give a brief mention to the shadow ban system. Now, this is something that isn't new with Modern Warfare 2. This has been a problem for several years now, but it's still a negative with the game, and it is frustrating for those players that get stuck in a shadow ban loop. Essentially, as far as we're aware, you can get shadow banned due to excess reports, even if you're not cheating. So if you're just a really good player, you have a really snappy aim, for instance, you get reported a lot, you end up in a shadow ban, which means you can technically still play the game, but you'll end up in shadow ban lobbies, which means your matchmaking times increase drastically. Oftentimes your ping is also completely unreasonably high. And if you are in these shadow ban lobbies, you're often running into actual cheaters that have also been shadow banned while their account is under review. So effectively speaking, if you get shadow banned, the game becomes essentially unplayable for you. And the problem isn't necessarily that shadow banning exists, it seems to be working because when you're shadow banned in those lobbies, you are playing with actual cheaters in there, which means it is catching actual cheaters as well. However, that false positive rate seems to be way too high, and more importantly, is many people that find themselves shadow banned, once they're cleared of that shadow ban, they often find themselves being shadow banned again, like within a week of being cleared. And that obviously sucks for people that paid full price for the game. They're not cheating, the game determined they're not cheating while they were in that shadow ban initially, and yet they end up in a loop where they just can't seem to escape a shadow ban, and therefore they can't really play the game properly. So again, this isn't unique to Modern Warfare 2, but I do think this is something that needs to be looked at for the future with the Call of Duty franchise. Next, let's get into some really specific nitpicky things. One thing I noticed is the teammate collision is quite high, especially when that teammate has a riot shield on their back. I found that to be very frustrating. That's mainly like a shipment issue, but even on the regular maps, you'd still run into situations where teammates would block you in certain areas. You couldn't get it through a doorway, for instance, and it's just kind of frustrating. I felt the collision was just a little too high. After that, one little thing that I really disliked with Modern Warfare 2, and I know some people like this because it's like realistic or it just makes for a cool moment, I hate the fact that when you shoot a streak down, that streak, like with VTOL for instance, lands somewhere on the map or near the map, blows up, and kills anybody that's within the radius of that through no fault of their own, and also with often zero counterplay available to this. Now, I'd say it's neat from like a cinematic or realism point of view, but from a gameplay perspective, it just feels so strange that you do the right thing, you do the thing that's meant to help the team out, only for that to backfire and kill you and a bunch of your teammates. Again, often with zero counterplay available to that. If it lands right where all your teammates happen to be spawning in, well, too bad. The fact that you shot that streak down turned out to be a negative for your team. And it's just backwards to me. There should be incentive to shoot down streaks, not a potential punishment for shooting that streak down. Again, super nitpicky thing, obviously not a game breaker for me, just something that created unnecessarily frustrating situations. After that, something that I realize is quite subjective, but for me personally, I didn't like the fact that they brought staged reloads to the game while eliminating the potential for a reload cancel. I've talked about this with quite a bit of detail in previous videos. Basically, I just feel like for the faster paced, arcadey style of gameplay that Call of Duty has, mainly talking about 6v6, I think reload canceling is quite important to have. I think you need to be able to react quickly with how quickly things can change. You can't always predict that perfect time to reload. And I think staged reloads are much better suited to like slower paced mil sim style games or more open world style games where there's often more room to breathe. And then finally, I do want to have a brief discussion about some game modes. The first thing is this game launched with no hardcore game mode at all. They had tier 1 instead, which was not a viable replacement for hardcore, in my opinion at least. And while I'm not much of a hardcore player personally, so this didn't affect me directly too much, there's a solid group of the Call of Duty community that are just hardcore players. That's all they ever play in Call of Duty, and that's all they've ever played for the past decade or more of Call of Duty. And it's a staple mode that has been there for every Call of Duty game up until Modern Warfare 2. And I think it was a very obvious mistake to not have hardcore included at launch with the game. Now, I wasn't opposed to them trying something different with Tier 1, but Tier 1 wasn't a proper replacement and shouldn't have been treated like a replacement to the hardcore game mode. Instead, they should have brought Tier 1 as potentially like a limited time mode to see how people felt about it, while still having hardcore always available as a staple section. Additionally, there's certain game modes that I feel just didn't get enough support to them. The big one that's coming to mind for me that I usually enjoy a lot is Infected. I actually think there was a lot of potential for Infected in Modern Warfare 2, and it plays quite well. The problem is it has a very limited map pool. You don't get to play Infected on every map in the game, not even close to every map in the game. And to my knowledge, I think there's still only 2 different loadouts that are chosen for Infected. So for me at least, Infected got stale way too quickly, and it's just unfortunate. I feel like there was a lot of potential there, but they just didn't put anything into it to improve the experience at all, and it always just felt like a super limited version of what Infected should have been. And that's just one example, the main one that comes to mind for me at least, because that is a mode that I actively enjoy, especially in this new era of SBMM. It's like that one experience where you can just go and fully chill and relax, and not have that pressure to perform at your absolute peak. And then finally, I just want to have a brief section talking about Ground War. I unfortunately really didn't like Ground War in Modern Warfare 2, even though I had a great time with Ground War overall in Modern Warfare 2019. And one of the biggest reasons I didn't like Ground War this time around is simply due to that spawn helicopter. To me at least, it completely ruined the concept of map control, which is such a key part of the core experience of Call of Duty, and especially Ground War in Modern Warfare 2019. You have to fight for that position on your map and earn that position on the map. And there used to be a lot of like push and pull and back and forth there. Now I just feel like that spawn helicopter allows people to land wherever they want, including rooftops, and it just spreads everything all around and creates for a much more randomized experience with little to no feeling of map control. You never really feel like you push for a position and you really earn that position because you just have people landing all around you with their parachutes. Now, that was the primary reason. I'm sure there would have been other reasons as well. Perhaps the map design just wasn't ideal for some of the maps on Ground War. But in either case, Ground War is just a mode I didn't enjoy at all in this game, even though it's something I loved in Modern Warfare 2019. And with that, I think that's a good place to leave this. I'm sure there's a bunch of other little things that I could have pulled out for this video, but I think I covered all of the main points that I wanted to cover in today's video. At the end of the day, just some final words on this. I didn't hate Modern Warfare 2. Like I've said, I've managed to find some fun with the game throughout the year. It's just unfortunate that it felt like it was held back in so many significant ways, and there were a bunch of gameplay decisions that I just thought were terrible for the game and really held it back from reaching anywhere close to its full potential. Now, one thing I will say is for the 6v6 experience at least, I actually enjoyed Modern Warfare 2 more than Modern Warfare 2019. The opposite is true if we're talking about Ground War, but I primarily lean toward the 6v6 experience, and for me at least, this was a better experience overall compared to Modern Warfare 2019 6v6. But that's also really not saying a lot since Modern Warfare 2019 had my least favorite 6v6 experience out of any Call of Duty game in franchise history. So I'd still put Modern Warfare 2 fairly low on my list of Call of Duty games, but at the same time, I will admit I managed to find some fun with the game throughout its life cycle, despite all the issues. And with that, this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. It's time to let it all out and vent your frustrations. I want to know the main things that you feel they did wrong with Modern Warfare 2. And also, if you wanted to add just your overall opinion on this game, I'd love to hear that down below as well. If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.